Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through the paper walls of a tiny farmhouse in feudal Japan, just as dawn seeps in like watered down ink. Outside, you hear the soft rush of wind over rice paddies, a rooster that sounds way too energetic for this hour, and the creaking of wood as your neighbors start to move. Inside, you're wrapped in a thin quilt on a straw mat, staring up at a smoky, so darkened ceiling, trying to ignore the draft sneaking in through every gap. This is your life as a peasant, and tax season is coming like a slow, heavy storm you can already smell in the air. You probably won't survive this, by the way, at least not without crying over your missing central heating and grocery store snacks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink awake to the faint gray of early morning filtering through shoji screens, the paper patched in a few places where someone's elbow or a curious child went straight through. The air is cold, the kind of damp chill that crawls into your bones. Your nose is stuffy from smoke, your hair smells faintly of last night's fire. Somewhere in the corner, a mouse makes a daring raid on a forgotten grain or two, and you silently root for it, even though that's basically stealing from your own dinner. You roll off your futon, your knees already complaining, even though you're, what, maybe 30? In peasant years, that's practically middle age. The packed earth floor is hard and cool under your bare feet. The house is one room, divided more by habit than walls, sleeping area, hearth, storage, and the essential don't trip over that bundle of rice zone. You listen. Roosters. A dog barking. The thud of wooden clogs on the path outside. And over all of it, the low murmur of voice just a little more tense than usual. It's that tension that tells you what today really is. Tax season. Not tax day, like a neat little deadline circled on a calendar, but tax season, a whole stretch of weeks when everything feels slightly off. People talk quieter. Smiles are thinner. You count every sack of rice 3 times. You push open the sliding door, and the cold air slaps your face fully awake. Mist hangs over the paddies, empty now after the harvest but still lined and diked like a patchwork quilt. Farther off, you see smoke rising from other farmhouses. A neighbor trudges past with a bundle of firewood, gives you a nod that says, without words, yeah. It's that time again. You know the rhythm by heart. All year, you plant, weed, pray, and sweat to coax rice out of these stubborn fields. You're not just growing food. You're growing taxes. In Tokugawa, Japan, the land tax is mostly paid in rice, neatly bundled and stacked, then hauled away to support the daimyo feudal lordess samurai and all the machinery of the domain. 1 koku of rice, the official unit, is supposed to feed 1 person for a year. You don't get measured in salaries, your life is measured in theoretical stomachs. Mainstream historians will tell you that across much of the Edo period, peasants like you might owe around 40 to 50% of your rice as tax, sometimes more, sometimes less. Historians still argue whether that number left most villagers miserable and half-starved, or actually decently fed compared to European peasants of the same time. From where you're standibergoat, staring at fields you don't legally own, it doesn't feel like much of a debate. Over by the village path, a couple of older men are already gossiping. You catch snippets, the word dakenth domains axophisculence with that careful, not quite insulting but definitely not loving tone. Someone says they heard the official's assistants arrived at the magistrate's office yesterday. Someone else swears they saw Packers down by the main road, loaded with measuring tools and registers, which is about as exciting as saying the spreadsheet brigade just rolled into town. You scratch the back of your neck and watch the faint trail of your own breath in the morning air. Your whole year has been bent around what those men will write down in their ledgers. How many bales? How much yield? How much you get to keep, and how much walks away on other people's shoulders. You step around to the storage Arith raised floor granary, your little wooden fortress of calories. The door is barred, more to keep out moisture and mice than people, but on mornings like this, it feels like you're guarding treasure. Inside, the smell of rice is warm and comforting, like dry straw and sun. Each bundle represents days of your life, ankle deep in water, bent over under the summer sun, or shivering in early spring, replanting delicate seedlings with numb fingers. You squint, doing mental math. You'll never write these numbers down. That would look suspiciously literate and ambitious too in your head. You keep a running tally. This much for the Lord. This much for seed next year. This much for your family. This much for offerings at the temple, and maybe, if you're lucky, a little extra to sell for salt, miso, or a scrap of cotton cloth that doesn't already have 10 patches. Out of all the odd details of this world, one of your favorite small village quirks is how measurements sometimes get improvised. Officially, the domain surveyors use proper wooden measuring boxes for rice. Unofficially, some villagers still talk about the old days when a unit of field could be paced out by how many steps it took the headman to walk the edge in his straw sandals or legs, mysteriously bigger fields. You wouldn't try that trick on the Dakin, but in quiet corners of the village, people remember. You hear a child whine from a neighboring house, a woman choosing them gently. Kids sense tax season, too, in the way adults stop talking when they walk into the room. It's like when your phone suddenly goes silent and everyone in the group chat disappearment is definitely up. Across the village, the small shrine at the edge of the woods peeks through the trees, its gate silhouetted in the mist. You've already gone there more than once this year, burning a thin stick of incense, mumbling for good harvests and maybe, just maybe, slightly forgetful tax officials. Mainstream religion here is a blend of Buddhism and Shinto, with a sprinkling of folk superstition thrown in like seasoning. The priests probably roll their eyes at some of your more home-brewed charms, but hey, when half your rice is about to walk away, you try everything. As you breathe in the cold, smoky air, you think about how invisible you are in the grand political structure. Somewhere far away, in Edo, the shogun's officials carefully track each domain's rice output, because rice means power. Domains are ranked in koku, not in land area. Your village is just a dot on someone's map, a number on a report. Yet that number is built on the cracks in your hands and the ache in your lower back. You shift your weight, stretching a little, feeling muscles complain that you haven't even started work yet. You can't afford to be sick now. There's no health insurance, no vacation time, no mental health day. Your self-care routine is basically, on die, and if you must, please do it after planting season. You pad back inside to warm your hands over the faint glow of last night's embers, coaxing a new flame to life. Someone in the household mutters about how much rice you'll have to boil today, how much you should not eat, and how this year's harvest stacked up. Somebody makes a joke quickly, but sharp about inviting the Dakin over for dinner and then serving him exactly his share, nothing. You all laugh softly, because if you don't laugh, you might start saying those things louder, and that could get dangerous. Today, you'll go through the motions of a normal morning, feeding the animals, sweeping, checking the paddies, dikes as you keep one eye on the road. At any moment in the coming days, you might see riders or hear that the officials have reached the next village over. Your heart will do that unpleasant little tap dance, and your stomach will feel like you skipped breakfast, even if you didn't. All year long, your life is scheduled around sun and season. But in the back of your mind, another clock is ticking, the tax calendar. Every sprout you plant, every weed you pull, is really a negotiation with men you haven't even met. And as you step out into the cool morning light, shoulders already tightening in anticipation, You can feel if this year, like every year, is going to be a very delicate balancing act indeed. By the time you step out toward the fields, the mist has thinned, and the village is in modi-wound clogs clacking, voices calling, tools clanging gently as people shoulder hoes and sickles. The paddies stretch out in careful rectangles, dikes like low earthen walls, irrigation channels glinting faintly in the cool light. They look peaceful from a distance, like a painting. You know better. Up close, they're ankle-deep in mud and anxiety. You head first to the dry field just beyond the rice paddies, where winter barley or millet clings stubbornly to the soil. In a lot of domains, peasants don't just grow rice, you double crop, squeezing as much as you can out of land that never really gets a vacation. The Lord doesn't care what clever rotation system you're experimenting with, he mostly cares about the rice. But those other grains, the scruffy cousins of your prized crop, are what keep you alive after the tax bales roll away. The year has its choreography. In late winter and early spring, when your fingers are still numb and your breath is a little cloud in the air, you start by preparing nursery beds. You smooth out a small patch of soil, sowing rice seeds densely. These will be your seedlings, your tiny green army you'll later transplant into the paddies. It's tedious, bending over for hours, but you do it with the quiet precision of someone who knows that each seed is a potential argument with the daikon. Mainstream history will tell you that by the Edo period, rice agriculture in Japan was already highly developed, with advanced irrigation systems, terraced fields in hilly areas, and careful timing of transplanting to maximize yields. You don't think about it as advanced agronomy, you just know that if you mess up the timing, the seedlings sulk, the stalks stay short, and the tax man still expects his share as if you'd had a perfect harvest. It's a very motivating feedback loop. Once the nursery beds are prepared, you move on to the paddies themselves. You and your neighbors repair dikes, patching places where water could seep away. You clear out the irrigation channels, scooping up mud and weeds with a bamboo scoop, the cold water numbing your hands until they feel like someone else's. If you're lucky, the village's communal waterworks are in decent Schipeckerfeli managed canals that bring river water down through a system of gates. If you're unlucky, a small landslide upstream or a squabble with the next village has turned water management into a drama. As you slog around, a neighbor mutters about the old story that if you whistle in the paddies at night, fox spirits might answer, leading you into the water and stealing your soul or at least your sandals. It's one of those quirky village beliefs that everyone claims not to take seriously, but then somehow nobody volunteers to check the dikes alone after dark. You'd rather not test which version is true, honestly. When the time comes to flood the fields, you watch the water creep in, turning dusty soil into shining mirrors. The paddies slowly disappear under a few inches of gleaming surface, reflecting the sky. You wade in, mud sucking at your toes, and start the transplanting. Bending from the waist, you grab small clumps of seedlings from the nursery bundle and jab them one by one into the soft, squelching mud. Row after row. Step plant, step plant. Your back starts complaining before the first row is done, and by the end of the field, you feel approximately 90 years old. You're not alone, of course. Transplanting is a team sport. Families work side by side, moving in lines like a slow, green wave. People sing rhythmic work songs to keep the pace and distract from the pain. The melodies wend over the water, a mix of old shrine chants and lyrics someone's uncle definitely made up last year. Historians still argue whether these communal work rhythms were primarily about efficiencying everyone on the same beat or about reinforcing social bonds and hierarchy. You just know that when the songs are loud, the work somehow feels a little lighter. When you stand and stretch for a moment, trying not to think about how nice a modern chiropractor would be, you glance over at the far edge of the fields. There, the village headman is doing his own quiet calculations. He doesn't just see green plants, he sees numbers. Potential bales. Potential trouble. If the village doesn't meet its assessed tax, the officials won't come after some abstract spreadsheet, they'll come after him, and by extension, after all of you. The seasons roll forward in your mind, even as you're still ankle deep in this one. After transplanting comes weeding, which might actually be worse. You head back into the paddies weeks later, now with the sun high and hot, the water warm and fragrant with the smell of mud and young plants. You crouch and move between rows, pulling up intruding weeds by hand. No herbicides, no neat little tools that magically save your back, just you, mud, and stubborn plants that do not care about your tax obligations. You get bitten by insects, something crawls over your toes that you decide not to identify, you accidentally fall and come up dripping, your straw hat askew. Someone on the levee laughs, and you flip water at them with a muddy hand, because humor is free and you need something to keep you from screaming at the sky. One of the stranger little details of your world is the importance of nice oilies, the polite term for human waste. In many areas, wealthier households in town actually pay for the privilege of having farmers collect their waste to use as fertilizer. It's like a very weird subscription service where you're both the janitor and the customer. You're not above hauling sloshing buckets of the stuff to spread in your fields. If it makes the rice grow tall enough to impress the surveyors, you'll line up cheerfully with your ladle. As summer deepens, you walk the dikes in the evenings, checking water levels. Too deep, and the plants drown. Too shallow, and they parch. You adjust tiny wooden gates with a practiced hand, listening to the trickle and rush. The village as a whole coordinates these flows, because water doesn't care whose paddy is whose, it just follows gravity. Arguments over who stole whose water at night can simmer for years, turning into family feuds that make the tax man's visit look like a pleasant social call. By late summer and early autumn, your rice has turned from bright green to that golden hue that makes your heart thump a little faster. You walk out, rub a grain between your fingers, bite it to test its hardness. Almost ready. Harvest time is approaching, the one moment of the year where the balance of power tilts, just for a second, in your favor. Before the grain is cut, it's still theoretical. Once it's bundled and drying, it becomes something officials can actually count. Mainstream historians like to note that yields in the Edo period gradually increased, thanks to better tools, improved seed varieties, and more effective water management. There's even debate about whether peasants started to produce a surplus, selling rice and other crops in a growing market economy. From your vantage point, bent over cutting sheaves with a sickle, it doesn't feel like surplus. It feels like your knees are on fire and your shoulders have turned into boards. Harvest itself is strangely joyful, though. The village hums with movement. People move through the fields in lines, cutting, bundling, stacking. Children dart around carrying small loads, getting in the way and being tolerated because one day they'll be the ones doing this for real. Laughter comes more easily, jokes fly. Somebody makes a crack about this one's for the Lord, this one's for us, pretending to toss a bundle in an imaginary direction. Another neighbor says what you're all thinking, careful, the scarecrows might be undercover officials. You snort, then glance reflexively at the rojadettes in case. Once cut, the rice is dried on racks, stalks draped over wooden poles like rows of sun-bleached laundry. You walk among them, listening to the rustle in the breeze. The smell of drying grain is one of the few truly comforting scents you get all year. It smells like safety, like full bowls in winter. It also smells like incoming paperwork, because the drier and more measurable your harvest becomes, the closer you are to tax inspection. Then comes threshing, beating the grain off the stalks with flails or by treading. The air fills with chaff and dust, And at the end, you're covered head to toe in something that's not quite dirt and not quite food. You winnow the grain, tossing it in baskets to let the wind carry the lighter chaff away. You watch the clean grain cascade back down, each tiny piece another little unit of obligation. Packed into sacks, then tied into standard bales, your rice finally looks like the thing officials expect to see. Very neat, very countable, very tax-able. You store as much as you can in the granary, trying to keep track without looking like you're keeping track too carefully. Because here's the secret that no one says out loud: every choice you've made all year, how carefully you planted, how often you weeded, when you irrigated, how much fertilizer you dared to spread had not just the Lord's stomach in mind, but the exact moment you will stand and watch strangers measure what you've grown. You wipe sweat from your forehead, gaze across the harvested fields, and feel that familiar mix of pride and dread. The land has given what it can. Whether that will be enough, for both your family and your Lord, is the question that will define the months ahead. The morning the officials arrive, the village feels strangely quiet, even though everyone is up early and moving. Sound gets muffled somehow, like snow has fallen, except it's just nerves settling over everything like a thin, invisible blanket. You straighten your worn kimono, tugging at a patch near the hem, and step out into the lane. People are already drifting toward the open space near the shrine and the storehouse as rough excuse for a village square. Farmers you usually see in straw hats and work rags have put on their slightly less terrible clothes. It's the feudal version of business casual, which basically means still patched, but at least not muddy. At the center of it all stands the village headman, arms folded, brow furrowed. You can tell he didn't sleep much. His house sits a bit larger, a bit better built than most, with a slightly bigger storage shed out back. He's technically one of you peasants, but he's also the one who speaks to the domain officials, the one whose name appears in their ledgers. If the village fails, he's the first in the line of fire. No pressure. You join your neighbors as they form loose lines, bales of rice already arranged in neat rows beside the communal storehouse. The stacks look almost proud, bound with straw rope, ends cut tidy. You know exactly how many of those bales you carried, how many your shoulders still remember. A murmur ripples through the crowd, they're here. Down the dirt road come the domain mentwo 3, then Mordringer horses who are walking with the slow assurance of people who know no one is going to make them pull weeds today. At the center is the deacon, the magistrate's representative, flanked by assistants carrying writing cases, scrolls, and what might as well be portable anxiety machines, the standard measuring boxes. You eye those measuring boxes like they're wild animals. They're wooden, carefully made, with official markings showing they are the correct volume. Rice will be poured in, leveled off, and counted out to calculate exactly how many koku your village supposedly produced. The deacon's assistants set them down with almost theatrical care, as if to say, "Look, peasants, behold the sacred geometry of your suffering." Mainstream history notes that the koku system was the backbone of Tokugawa Japan. Domains were ranked by how many tens of thousands of koku they could collect, samurai stipends were paid in koku, and surveys tried to fix each village's taxable yield in koku per year. Historians still argue whether these surveys were reasonably accurate or quietly manipulated by both officials and villagers to suit their own interests. Standing here, watching those boxes, you're pretty sure everyone is massaging the trudhouts in opposite directions. The headman steps forward and bows deeply, his voice smooth and practiced as he offers formal greetings. He sounds calm, but you notice how tightly his hands are clasped. The deacon gives the faintest nod, the kind that says, "Yes, yes, let's get to the numbers." Behind him, an assistant unrolls a list, your village's name inked near the top, followed by last year's official yield. You and your neighbors hover near your respective bales, hands tucked in sleeves, faces carefully blank. You've all rehearsed this in your minds. Don't look too nervous, but also don't look too smug. And whatever you do, don't let your eyes flick toward that one granary where you may or may not have tucked away a few extra sacks. Not that you'd ever do such a thing, of course. Purely hypothetical. One of the low-key quirky things you've heard half rumor, half dark comedies that in some regions, peasants would secretly shave a sliver from the inside edge of their own measuring boxes over time, so the same volume held a little less. On the flip side, officials were suspected of doing the reverse with their standards, swelling the wood with water so more rice would fit. It's like the eternal struggle between your bathroom scale and your willpower, only now the scale has the power to arrest you. The measurement begins. Assistants open bales, the sound of straw rows snapping sharp in the cool air. Rice pours into the wooden boxes with a dry hiss, the smell rising warm and familiar. Each full box is leveled with a flat stick, excess brushed back into the sack. Numbers are muttered, recorded with quick flicks of the brush on paper. You stand straight, but your mind is doing frantic math again, trying to track how the count matches your own silent tally. You're not supposed to have a number in your head, you have the number system, of course you do. You've been counting since the first seedling took root. A neighbor leans closer, whispering from the side of his mouth. Their box looks fatter this year. You flick him a look that says, "Do you want to get us all killed?" And he immediately straightens, face smoothing back into practiced neutrality. Village politics hangs heavy in the air alongside the rice dust. Technically, the tax is assessed on the village as a unit. If the yield is lower than expected, the village must still somehow come up with its assigned quota, dipping into stored reserves or accepting debt. If it's higher, well, officially, that's wonderful news for your lord. Unofficially, you're all calculating how much extra might quietly disappear before anyone writes it down. The headman's role in this is delicate. He's been talking quietly with wealthier peasants for weeks, ones with slightly bigger fields, slightly fuller granaries. There are unspoken understandings, who can bear a little extra, who needs a break after a bad patch of land or an illness in the family. You're not in love with this mini hierarchy, but you depend on it. The village survives together or sinks together, no one can treat tax as purely a personal problem. As the count goes on, you notice the small rituals of soft influence begin. A boy from the headman's household appears with a tray of tea, bowing and offering it to the deacon and his assistants. The cups are ceramic, better than the rough wooden bowls you usually use. There might even be a tiny plate of swetsmotsky or dried persirma stuff out from a carefully hoarded stash. It's all terribly proper, of course. Just simple hospitality. Certainly not a bribe. Perish the thought. But you've heard stories from other villages, a particularly generous gift of especially polished rice or a small bag of coins, handed over discreetly, resulting in a more forgiving eye during the assessment. Historians still argue whether these quiet understandings were systemic corruption or simply a necessary lubrication in a rigid system. You're not too bothered by the label. If a cup of good tea and a slightly thicker envelope mean a few more bales get counted as lost to dampness, you're not going to complain. Speaking of dampness, one of the deacon's assistants eyes a stack of bales with clear skepticism. "These were harvested late?" he asks. The headman nods gravely, explaining about recent rains, how some fields were slow to dry. It's technically true, just maybe emphasized a bit. The implication is that some of the rice might not store well, might spoil. Spoiled rice can't be taxed, at least not in theory. The assistant reaches out, presses a thumb into a bale, testing firmness. You hold your breath. A few grains crumble and spill. He grunts, makes a note. You exhale so slowly you're not sure air is actually moving. In the background, you catch sight of the gawning new leader's head of your 5 household mutual responsibility group quivering like an anxious sparrow. The Tokugawa system bundles households into these little clusters, each responsible for keeping the others in line. If one family disappears in the night, fleeing tax burdens, the others can be held accountable. It's very efficient, in the same way your phone's location sharing is efficient at ruining surprise getaways. A brief dispute breaks out when one assistant claims last year's number suggests a higher expected yield this year. The headman counters, voice still respectful but a little firmer, reminding them of flooding in the lower fields, of pests. You chime in only when directly addressed, describing how you saw the water stagnate, the seedlings yellow. It's like testifying in a very high-stakes group project where the grade is hunger. There's a strange intimacy to this whole process. Men from distant offices peer into the literal fruits of your labor, touching and weighing what you've grown. They decide how much of it remains your child's porridge and how much becomes someone else's samurai stipend. They don't see your blistered hands or the fox stories whispered over late-night dike repairs, they see numbers on a scroll. By midday, the main counting is done. The final number is lower than the worst rumor you'd heard, but higher than the optimistic whispers. It could be worse. It could always be worse. The deacon clears his throat and announces the assessed tax for the year. How many bales will be taken as the Lord's share? You feel the words like a physical weight settling on your shoulders, but there's also that small current of relief, at least now you know. The unknown is often worse than the verdict. The headman bows again, accepting the decision with the grace of someone who will spend the next weeks quietly redistributing that burden among his people, smoothing ruffled feathers, and making sure no one starves loudly enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. As the officials begin to pack up, their assistants closing ink-stained cases and stacking the measuring boxes, you glance at the remaining baleshish ones that won't be loaded onto packerses. That's the core of your winter, your seed for next year, your tiny buffer against disaster. It doesn't look like much, but then, it never does. You shuffle back toward your house with the others, the village's collective breath slowly returning. The worst part of tax season being measured, weighed, and judged is over. Now comes the equally difficult part, figuring out how, exactly, you're going to live on what's left. Once the officials and their measuring boxes disappear down the road, the village doesn't exactly relax, it just shifts into a different gear. The official performance is over. Now it's time for the unofficial one. You spend the afternoon putting away tools, sweeping stray grains from the threshing floor, pretending that what's visible is all there is. Anyone walking through now would see a tired, slightly shabby village that's handed over its due and is settling into a modest, humble winter. Which is cute, because you know for a fact that this place runs on a whole second economy hiding just under the surface, like eels in muddy water. Back at your house, the hearth is glowing, the smoke curling up toward the darkened rafters. The rice tax has carved a large scoop out of your stores, and the reality of what's left is starting to sink in. Your family sits around the irori, embers hopping softly. This is when the other part of survival begins, the hustling. You pick up a handful of rice straw and start twisting it into rope. Your fingers move automatically, you've been doing this since you were big enough to sit without falling into the fire. Straw isn't just waste, it's raw material. You can turn it into sandals, rain capes, rope mats, thatch. In the long winter evenings, this is your workshop. Netflix doesn't exist, your content is the sound of straw rasping in your hands and the neighbors snoring through the thin wall. Mainstream history points out that Edo period peasants weren't just farmers, they were also craftspeople. Across Japan, rural households wove cloth, made paper, produced oil, charcoal, and countless small goods that fed a growing market economy. You don't call it diversifying your income streams, you just call it not starving. Your spouse sits nearby with a simple loom, shuttle clacking gently back and forth. Strips of hemp or cotton thread slowly become cloth, the pattern a little uneven where a child's hands helped wind the thread and got distracted halfway. Indigo blues, faded brown suckers of work and weather. If the cloth is good enough, a traveling merchant who visits the village on market days might buy a bowl, paying you in coins or in things you can't grow: salt, oil, maybe a tiny bit of sugar if you're very lucky. Sugar is a festival only, flex on your neighbor's luxury. You'd never waste it on tea on a random Tuesday. By the fire, the children twist scraps of straw into toy animals or tiny sandals, practicing the same motions you're doing at full scale. One of them holds up a wobbly little straw horse and asks if it can work in the fields for you tomorrow. You tell them it can start by pulling their share of the weeds next spring, and the adults chuckle. 3 jokes a day keeps the despair away. When the work by the hearth is done for the moment, you slip outside with a basket, the cold air biting your nose. There's still a little light left, and you want to check on one particular patch of land, a place you don't talk about loudly. It's a small terrace cut into a wooded hillside, half hidden by brush and trees. The soil there isn't great, and water is a bit of a problem, but it has one enormous advantage: it's not on anyone's official map. Hidden fields like this have their own unofficial vocabulary depending on the regimental nicknames passed down quietly. You step onto the narrow ridge, checking for footprints that aren't yours. The plants here might be hardy millet, beans, or root crop things less obvious than shining, easily counted rice. You sow them late, harvest them quietly, and store them in containers that never make an appearance on tax day. Historians still argue whether these hidden fields and underreported plots were widespread, almost standard practice, or isolated acts of quiet rebellion. From your vantage point, crouched in the fading light, brushing soil off a scrappy radish like it's a bar of gold, the answer feels obvious. If you can get away with it, you do it. You kneel and loosen a few plants, checking how the roots have filled out. Not a huge yield, but every extra bowl of gruel is a little less pressure on the main storehouse. You mentally list possible hiding spots back home under the floorboards, in a jar behind the woodpile, mixed with fodder for the animals. It's like playing an endless game of rice and seek. Back in the open fields, even some of the legal crops are a kind of side hustle. Where the paddies give way to drier land, you might grow a bit of cotton or indigo, depending on the region. The domain's focus on rice doesn't mean they'll ignore cash crops entirely, but there's sometimes more wiggle room. If you can spin your cotton into thread or dye cloth with indigo, merchants will take it off your hands for coinchos round, hold moan that jingle softly in a cloth pouch. Mainstream historians note that over the Edo period, this kind of commercialization of the countryside grew more significant. Villages like yours became quietly plugged into a wider web of regional markets, castle towns, and post stations. Whether that meant real prosperity for most peasants or just slightly shinier poverty depends on which historian you ask and how recently they've eaten. When you can spare the time, you join a few neighbors heading into the hills with hatchets and rope. Firewood doesn't appear by magic, and neither does charcoal. You follow narrow paths under cedar and bamboo, the forest air sharp with the smell of resin and earth. Technically, much of this woodland belongs to the domain or to nearby temples and shrines, so rights to cut branches or gather fallen wood are a complicated patchwork of custom and permission. You've learned exactly how much you can take before it stops being for household use and starts being we need to have a conversation with the magistrate. You cut smaller branches, bundle them, and sling them over your back. Some of this will go straight into your hearth. Some might be sold or traded in the next market you visit. There are always people with less time or strength to gather their own, and a good tidy bundle of dry firewood is basically the 17th century version of delivering premium fuel. The forest offers more than wood. In the right season, you search for wild greens, mushrooms, nuts, or mountain vegetablicious bitter, earthy flavors that arrive in spring and make your winter palate feel something again. There's always a small thrill when you spot something edible, like finding a bonus level in a game that mostly gives you mud and taxes. You have to be careful, though. Somewhere in the back of your memory, you carry stories of people who ate the wrong mushroom. Your personal policy is, if the old woman down the lane doesn't recognize it, it doesn't go in the pot. Down by the river or along the coast if you're in a seaside village, another set of side incomes waits in the water. You might cast small nets for fish, set basket traps for eels, or gather shellfish at low tide. The slosh of water around your legs, the faint sting of salt on your cracked hands, it all adds up to a different category of food, one that doesn't pass through the measuring boxes in the village square. There's a quirky little detail you once heard from a passing peddler about some villages using dried sardines as both fertilizer and a kind of currency in local trade. Imagine paying the neighbors hidden fish instead of pocket money. You're not sure if they were exaggerating, but honestly, in a world where night soil is valuable, fish money doesn't sound that strange. Speaking of peddlers, they're your tenuous link to the outside world. On certain days, a small crowd forms at the edge of the village when someone with a carrying pole approaches, boxes hanging from each end. They might sell needles, combs, cheap prints of kabuki actors, maybe a rare book for the priest or the slightly literate headman. You hover, pretending not to stare too hard at a simple metal knife or a bit of bright dyed thread, acting like you absolutely can take it or leave it. Inside, you're calculating how many extra straw sandals you'd have to sell to afford it. You trade. Maybe a bundle of charcoal, a coil of rope, a packet of dried vegetables goes one way, and a worn but usable tool comes back. The peddler shares gossip as freely as he takes your good sermons about rice prices in the nearest castle town, about famines to provinces over, about a peasant uprising put down with brutal force. You listen with the half-detached curiosity of someone who knows that big events travel slowly, but hunger comes quickly. Through all of this, you maintain the most important illusion, that you are exactly as poor as you appear, maybe even a little poorer. When strangers come through, especially anyone who looks even vaguely official, you dress in your roughest clothes, keep your nicer bowl or your better robe tucked out of sight. You don't let your house look too sturdy, a bit of visible wear can be tax armor. There are stories of peasants in some areas underreporting the quality of their fields, deliberately leaving small patches looking neglected to argue for a lower assessment next time. You've even heard a particularly dramatic tale of a village that supposedly uprooted a section of a dike just before a survey, making the land look too swampy to be worth full tax. Whether that one's true or just a fantasy passed around during long winter nights, you can't say, but no one tells those stories because they dream of paying more. You juggle all these roles: farmer, craftsperson, forager, part-time fisher, amateur economist, if the weary skill of someone who never had the option to specialize. If you had a resume, it would be several scrolls long and mostly written in straw dust. Instead, you have calloused hands, a handful of coins in a cloth pouch, a secret hillside patch, and a granary that looks a little emptier than it really is. Underneath the official numbers carved into domain ledgers, you and your neighbors are constantly doing your own quiet accounting: how much you can hide, how much you can make on the side, how much you can stretch. It's not heroism, exactly. It's just the only way you know to make life under tax season into something survivable. The first thing you do, once the tax bales are gone and the side hustles are lined up, is look hard at a bowl of food and ask the big question: how far can I stretch this before my stomach stages a rebellion? Your meals shift in a way you can feel in your bones. In stories and fancy paintings, peasants are always shown eating white rice, big steaming bowls of perfect polished grains. In reality, most of the good rice just walked away on the backs of packers, and a decent chunk of what's left has to last until the next harvest. So on your table, rice quietly turns into rice plus friends. You sit by the hearth, watching as tonight's dinner comes together in the pot. It's okay, porridge equation enough that the grains drift around like islands in a starchy sea. You bulk it out with millet or barley, the less glamorous cousins of rice. Some nights there's more millet than anything else, little yellow beads that squeak faintly between your teeth. If someone asks what's for dinner, the honest answer is creatively hydrated grains. Mainstream historians point out that for much of the Edo period, many peasants in Japan ate mixed grain porridge far more often than pure white rice. Polished rice was expensive and, in some areas, a privilege mostly for samurai and townspeople. Historians still argue whether this poor man's diet was actually healthier: more fiber, fewer blood sugar spikes, or just one more reminder that your lord's bowl looked very different from yours. You nibble a pikombe, a slice of daikon that's been brined for months, salty enough to make your eye twitch, and mentally calculate bowl-to-barrel ratios. How many nights like this until the snow melts? How many scoops can you spare to make a thicker porridge when someone is sick? You don't have spreadsheets, you have a gut sense and a ladle. Nothing is wasted. In autumn, you slice daikon and other vegetables into thin strips, dried them on poles in the cold, crisp air. Now they sit in jars and baskets, looking like sad little curls of parchment until they hit hot water and sudden magic happens. There's a quiet, almost smug satisfaction in turning what looks like kindling into soup. There's even a quirky little snack that sometimes appears when times aren't quite disastrous: cheap candies or roasted soybeans bought from a peddler, the kind of dagoshi that makes kids' eyes light up. They're not exactly dentist approved, but you don't have a dentist, so that's fine. A few sweet bites in winter can make the whole season feel a bit less gray. Clothing follows the same rule as food: stretch, patch, repeat. The kimono you're wearing now? It's on its third life at least. The outer layer is faded and thin, but underneath you can see the ghosts of older fabrics, patched in meticulously. Sometimes you unpick worn-out garments and reconstruct them from the least worn pieces, like a puzzle where the picture is always blue-brown patchwork. That aesthetic even has a modern nemaborieler of indigo-dyed cloth stitched and retested, turning poverty into accidental textile art. You don't think of it as art, you think of it as not walking around naked. But the patterns are beautiful in their own worn way, little white sashiko stitches marching across dark cloth like constellations. You sit in the evening light, needle between your fingers, reinforcing knees, elbows, collar edges. Each stitch is a tiny insurance policy against the day the fabric just gives up. Children's clothes are the most tragic and the most reused, garments shortened, then lengthened, then handed down, then converted into rags when even the patches knee patches. On especially tight years, you start scanning your meager belongings the way someone might scroll a shopping app. What could you pawn? In towns and larger villages, pawnshops exist where you can trade a garment or a tool for a small loan, hoping you'll earn enough later to buy it back. In your rural corner, the pawnshop might be the wealthier peasant down the road or the sake brewer in the nearby market town, whose side business is lending at interest. You turn over the idea of borrowing in your mind like a hot coal. Rice is short. Coins are shorter. You could go to the local moneylender, bow deeply, and ask for a loan of grain or cash, promising to repay after next harvest with interest like a hungry ghost. In Edo, Japan, rates could be steep. It's not unusual to hear whispers of 20, 30, even 50% a year for risky borrowers. One missed payment and suddenly your next tax season is already mortgaged. There's a quiet, anxious little ritual to asking. You choose your words carefully, present yourself as both needy enough to justify the loan and reliable enough to repay it. It's like trying to impress a very judgy relative who also controls your future dinner. Sometimes, instead of going to an individual, you turn to a communal safety net. In some villages and towns, people form mutual aid associations or rotating savings groups. Every month or season, each member contributes a little, one person takes the pot, then the next time someone else does. It's the analog, face-to-face version of a group savings app, except if you ghost the group, they know exactly where you live. Historians still argue whether these mutual health systems did more to empower ordinary people economically or just papered over structural poverty without changing much. For you, they're less a philosophical question and more a way to pay off an emergency loan without selling your last decent kimono. Then there are the temples and shrines. You don't think of them only as spiritual centers, they're also part of your practical survival kit. The local Buddhist temple might maintain a small granaria store of rice that can be lent out in bad years, to be repaid after a better harvest. The terms aren't always generous, but they're often kinder than the money lenders. Temples also organize alms for the very poor, gathering donations of grain or coins during festivals. On a bitterly cold evening, you trudge up the temple steps, hands tucked into your sleeves, breath clouding in front of you. The bell hangs heavy and dark, ropes worn smooth by years of hands. You bow, clap, or press your palms together depending on whether you're at a shrine or a temple, and your whispered prayer is extremely down to earth: please, just enough. Enough food. Enough strength. Enough mercy from officials who think of you as a line in a ledger. There's a quirky little folk belief, at least in the tales you've heard, that if you write your worries or debts on a scrap of paper and leave it at a certain shrine, the kami might lighten your burden. You're pretty sure the shrine gods don't actually negotiate with moneylenders, but sometimes you tuck a tiny note into a crack in the wood anyway. It's not magic, it's therapy with incense. The social customs of the village double as emotional life support. When things are tight, people share a little more in small, strategic ways. A neighbor might appear with a bowl of stew because we made too much, and you both pretend this isn't a quiet act of charity. Next month, you'll show up at their door with a bundle of dried greens or help repair their roof. No one calls it a debt, but everyone remembers. Wakes and funerals become oddly practical too. When someone dies, the village gathers, bringing small offerings of rice, sake, or coins. It's partly for the soul of the departed and partly to ensure the surviving family doesn't go under. Grief and grain get mixed together in the same smoky room. You notice how the calendar of rituals, boon years, first shrine visits, harvest festivals, ancestor dispunctions the gray slog of coping. Even when money is short, people try to scrape together something special, a slightly thicker maki cake, an extra vegetable in the soup, a sip more sake than usual. For one night, you let the porridge be a little richer and your worries a little quieter. Mainstream historians point out that village communities in Edo, Japan often had strong norms of mutual aid and shared responsibility. They weren't utopias, but people did lean on each other. Historians still argue whether this communalism was mostly organic solidarity or carefully enforced from above by village leaders and domain policies. From inside your drafty house, listening to a neighbor's soft singing drift through the night, it feels like both genuine kindness wrapped in obligation. As winter deepens, your belt notches in a little tighter. You grow used to waking with a hollow feeling and going to bed with a slightly better one. Your patched clothes grow thinner at elbows and knees. You juggle tiny loans, borrowed grain, and favors like a circus performer with one too many plates in the air. And always, beneath the surface of this careful balance, lurks the question you don't like to look at directly: what happens if the next harvest fails, or the Lord raises the tax, or the moneylender calls in his debts all at once? Survival, right now, is possible. But the margin for error is razor thin, and all it would take is one really bad year for the quiet coping to turn into something more desperate. Of course, the question you keep pushing to the back of your mind eventually stops being hypothetical. One year, the bad thing doesn't stay a scary story from another province. It shows up in your own fields. It starts with the weather being wrong. Spring is too cold, or too wet, or too dry. The seedlings in the nursery beds sulk instead of sprouting brightly. When you push your fingers into the soil, it's either clammy and sour or dust dry. You tell yourself it'll even out. Weather always bounces back, right? That's what you say to your family, with a smile that feels a little stiff around the edges. Then summer comes, and it doesn't get better. Maybe a cold snap hits in what should be the growing season, kind of chill that makes you see your breath over flooded paddies that should be warm. Or storms roll through one after another, pounding rain flattening the tender stalks. You wade through water that's higher than normal, your sandals lost somewhere in the mud, and you look at your rice, yellowing in all the wrong ways. You know, with a sinking, gut-deep certainty, that the numbers won't add up this time. Mainstream historians can point to specific disasters: the Kyoho famine in the 1730s, the Temi famine in the 1780s, the Tenpo famine in the 1830s, when cold weather, volcanic eruptions, and bad policy combined to wipe out harvests across whole regions. They write about mortality rates and domain responses. You just stand there in the drizzle, watching your plants rot, and think, this is how those stories start. You're not helpless, you do everything you can. You replant what's salvageable, slap hastily patched dikes into place, haul more night soil, even though the smell turns your stomach now. You and your neighbors stay out late in the fields, voices hoarse from shouting over the rain and the frogs. Little charms appear at the edges of paddies of paper, tied to sticks, tiny offerings half hidden in the grass. Nobody admits they put them there, but everybody notices. There's even that old quirky custom someone suggests in a low voice, staging a mock trial of a scarecrow, accusing it of failing to protect the fields, then dramatically tossing it into the river as if bad luck could just be washed away. You know it's ridiculous, but on the night they do it, half the village shows up anyway. When you watch the straw figure bob down the dark water, you feel a sting in your eyes that has nothing to do with smoke. Harvest time comes, and the fields look thin, patchy. You cut shorter stalks, smaller panicles. The familiar rustle of drying rice is fainter. When you thresh, the piles of grain are wrong. Too low. You pile them anyway, as if stacking them higher will make them more. And then, inevitably, comes the part you were dreading: the officials. The measuring boxes land on the village square with the same dull thud as always, but this time the sound feels like a hammer. You line up the bales you have, and it doesn't take a genius to see the problem. There are gaps where piles should be. The headman bows deeper than usual, voice tighter as he explains about the weather, the pests, how entire plots yielded barely enough to replant. The deacon listens, expression giving very little away. His assistants exchange glances, brush tips hovering over the paper. Historians still argue whether domain officials in bad years were mostly predatory, squeezing villages dry regardless of circumstances, or sometimes genuinely try to reduce burdens and open granaries. The record is mixed, cruel crackdowns in some places, relief measures in others. Standing here, watching numbers appear on the scroll, you'd be happy with any outcome that doesn't end in starvation. The verdict is a partial mercy. The tax is reduced a bit, not enough. The lord has expenses, samurai still expect stipends. Rice still has to flow up the ladder, even when there's barely enough at the bottom. What that means in practice is brutal math. You watch bales carried away, and what remains is clearly not enough to comfortably feed every mouth and hold seed for next year. The hidden hillside patch suddenly looks less like a bonus and more like a lifeless. Officials never find it. And this is where survival starts to blur into resistance. In the weeks that follow, quiet cheating becomes less a cautious side habit and more a necessity. A few granary lids miscounted. A sack lost in transit. A household insisting their small store of mixed grains is all they have, while a clay jar under the floor tells a slightly different story. You join in, because at a certain point honest taxpayer stops sounding like a virtue and starts sounding like person who voluntarily starved their children. You're not looking to topple the shogunate, you just want enough okayu in the pot. At the same time, louder forms of pushback begin to simmer. Villagers gather at night in the headman's house, the oil lamp so low it's barely more than a glow. People talk more openly than usual. Voices shake, not from cold this time but from anger riding on fear. Someone suggests a petition, a formal written plea to the domain, asking for tax reductions or rice from official granaries. In Edo, Japan, these petitions are a recognized form of protest, respectful on the surface, deeply desperate underneath. You know stories of peasants trekking miles to a castle town, kneeling outside a gate with a document clasped in shaking hands, waiting to see if anyone will accept it. Another voice suggests something riskier, an iki. Haikosuko Peasants, a prestigious Edo period records. Sometimes it's a riot at a sake brewer's storehouse in town, with crowds demanding that hoarded rice be sold at fair prices. Sometimes it's a village coalition refusing to pay full tax, marching with banners and drums, chanting that they can't give what they don't have. Historians still argue whether these iki were primarily about immediate survivability. Taxes are also carried a growing sense of injustice and political consciousness. From where you sit, picking at a frayed sleeve, it feels pretty simple. People who are starving eventually stop whispering. Rumors reach your village from the roads that also carry tax rice. In the last market town, peasants smashed the doors of a wealthy merchant's granary, dragged out sacks, and shared them in the street. In another province, a crowd surrounded an official's residence, shouting until he fled out the back. In still another, troops were called in, and the stories of what happened next turn quiet and vague, with a lot of gestures and broken-off sentences. You understand the gaps. No one wants to say out loud what soldiers' blades do to unarmed farmers. You're caught between wanting to join those angry voices and wanting to keep your head attached to your body. You have children. Old parents. A spouse who gives you that look that says, wordlessly, be careful. You make a joke about not looking great in prison stripinsta that peasants get stripes, just rope it, the laugh dies quickly. Some people choose a third option, they leave. Flight is its own kind of rebellion. In a really bad year, families slip away at night, carrying what they can on their backs. Maybe they aim for a nearby town, hoping to find work as laborers or servants. Maybe they drift toward a different domain rumored to be more lenient. Officially, peasants are tied to their village, leaving without permission is illegal. Unofficially, hungry people walk anyway. Your Gonagnu system turns on itself then, neighbors pressure to report if someone deserts, because the tax quota doesn't shrink just because a body disappeared. You've heard of cases where the families left behind are punished, fines levied, fields reassigned. The social fabric you rely on to stretch porridge can also act as a net to keep you from escaping the pot. In your own village, the tension builds like a storm that can't decide whether to break. The headman finally agrees to send a petition, using carefully chosen words to describe the poor harvest, the reduced stores, the village's loyal service. No one writes, "We are furious and terrified," but those words are there between the lines. You volunteer to help carry the petition partway to the district office. The walk is long, crunching over frosted ground, your breath white in the air, the scroll tucked into a protective cloth case like it's a baby bird. As you go, you pass other travelsrafts with lighter loads than last year, pilgrims with thinner faces, a group of farmers from another village carrying their own worry-wrapped document. There's a strange, weary solidarity in those nods you exchange. No one has to say why they're on the road, the empty fields say it for them. Sometimes, the petition works, at least partly. The domain orders a further tax reduction, or opens its granaries, releasing rice as loans or outright relief. Official historians of the time make careful note of the benevolence of the Lord. Later scholars sift those records and the occasional peasant testimony, trying to decide, was this enough? Did it come too late? Historians still argue whether domain governments were basically rigid machines or patchwork systems that sometimes bent under pressure. If you're lucky, your village lands on the less awful side of that debate. If you're not, resistance turns a shade darker. Maybe there's a brief, chaotic moment in the market town when a crowd surges, shouting, hands grabbing at sacks. Maybe someone hurls a stone that actually connects with an official's head. Maybe soldiers arrive. You hear about it in Peastrush, the peddler who speaks too fast, the neighbor who heard from his cousin's landlord's nephew. The details blur, but the message is clear. The line between quiet cheating and open revolt is thin, and stepping across it can be fatal. In the end, most of your resistance stays small and stubborn. You keep the hidden field going. You forget to mention a jar of beans in the corner. You join the singing when villagers choose a festival day to dance a little harder, drink a little more, and complain a little louder in lyrics that sound harmless if you're not listening carefully. Your rebellion isn't a single big explosion, it's 1,000 tiny decisions not to give everything. To the domain. To the taxman. To despair. And if, in the darkest nights of a famine year, you lie awake on your straw mat, listening to the wind scrape against the walls, and imagine what it would be like if those measuring boxes vanished forever, well, that's just a dream. Tomorrow, you'll get up, patch your clothes, stir the thin porridge, and keep doing the delicate, dangerous work of surviving under a system that was never designed with your comfort in mind. And yet, even hereunder all the mud and mathlift keeps sneaking in little bright spots, like wildflowers growing out of a cracked dike. Months after that miserable tax season, when the worst of the panic has faded and the world stubbornly keeps turning, you wake one morning and realize that today is actually a little special. Not because the Lord suddenly canceled taxes, you're not that delusional, but because the calendar says it's time for something besides work and worry. The year's rhythm isn't just planting, weeding, harvesting, paying. It's also New Year's, and first shrine visits, and local festus femchulation burst into your village like someone briefly turned the saturation up on your very beige lifestyle. New Year's is the big one. You spend the last days of the old year sweeping everything's yard, even the storage corners where spiders have established fully functioning democracies. You're not just cleaning, you're symbolically brushing away last year's bad luck, debts, and arguments. Sadly, physical debts do not evaporate quite as easily as dust. On New Year's Eve, you and your neighbors line up at the shrine or temple, breath puffing in the cold night, waiting to ring the bell and make a wish. Somewhere, a priest chants sutras, someone's kid falls asleep standing up. You clap your hands, bow, and ask the gods for what you always ask: better harvests, gentler officials, fewer surprise your field is flooded again moments. Mainstream historians like to point out that New Year's in Edo, Japan was one of the rare times even samurai and townspeople took real breaks, visiting shrines, exchanging gifts, eating special foods. Peasants didn't get week-long vacations, but even you feel time loosen a little. For a day or two, nobody talks about koku. Well, almost nobody. Back home, you put on your least patched kimantha, one where the burrow stitching actually looks kind of intentage, and sit near the fire with a bowl of something slightly fancier than usual. Maybe there's maki in the soup, thick and chewy. Maybe someone splurged on a little fish or a dusting of bonito flakes on top. It's still humble, but it tastes like celebration. The kids get a tiny coin or two as New Year's gifts, solemnly handed over as if they're receiving a royal inheritance. They immediately start plotting how to spend it on the most structurally unsound candy possible next time a peddler appears. You pretend to scold them and secretly enjoy how serious they look, clutching their cloth pouches like miniature landlords. As seasons roll on, other festivals return, each with their own flavor. In summer, there's Obonthi time when, it's said, ancestors' spirits come back to visit. Lanterns glow in the dusk, hung from eaves and set afloat on rivers. You stand with everyone else, watching little floating lights drift away downstream, each one carrying prayers and memories. For a few moments, the constant forward push of survival softens. You feel your life as part of a long line, not just a single, tired body in a muddy field. Then there are the purely local matsuri, tied to shrines and deities who, frankly, might be a little eccentric. In some regions, people hoist portable shrinus meshins their shoulders and stagger through the streets, shouting and laughing, the heavy, gilded structure rocking dangerously. You join the crowd that presses in close, clapping, tossing a few coins, feeling the drumbeats thump through your ribs like a second heartbeat. Historians still argue whether these festivals primarily reinforced social order beyond parading under the Lord's benevolent gaze or gave peasants a rare chance to turn things upside down, if only symbolically. From where you're standing, half drunk on cheap's sake and the sheer relief of not being in a paddy, it feels like a bit of both. The officials may be watching, but so are the gods, and tonight you get to be loud. There are quirky customs, tooth kind, that would make a modern visitor blink. In some villages, you've heard, there are fertility rituals that involve parading around with, let's call them, very confidently carved wooden objects to encourage good harvests and healthy babies. In others, people build giant phallic snowmen in winter and pretend it's just for the crops. You snort when you hear these stories, then glance at your own shrine's more modest decorations and think, well, we just stick to rice, but good for them. On festival days, even your patched clothes feel festive. Someone might add a bright sash or tuck in a fresh sprig of greenery. You see your neighbors not as hunched figures over hose, but as dancers, drummers, storytellers. A few young men set up impromptu sumo bouts in an open patch of dirt, stomping and clapping, bellies out, faces fierce. The winner gets bragging rights and maybe an extra cup of sake. The loser gets dirt on his backside and every honest laughter. It's a fair trade. Speaking of sake, this is the time of year when it flows a bit more freely than your everyday budget really thinks is wise. Rice is precious, but some of it has been brewed into this cloudy, warm liquid kindness that numbs, just for a night, the memory of measuring boxes and hidden fields. You sip from a shared cup, feeling the heat slide down your throat and into your chest. Someone tells a joke about the daikon tripping over his own oversized measuring box and falling into a river. Someone else adds, Didislino, it's a river full of eels, now the box is so swollen with water it won't float. You all laugh too hard, shoulders shaking, because you're not just laughing at a clumsy official, you're laughing at the fear he represents. It's rebellion, but in punchline form. Later, when the drums quiet and the younger, drunker crowd drifts off to try their luck at festival night flirting, you find yourself near a lantern, listening to a storyteller. Maybe it's an old man with a voice like creaking wood, or a passing performer with a small audience. They spin tales of heroic samurai, tragic lovers, clever peasants who outwit cruel lords. You sit cross-legged, eyes half closed, letting the words wash over you. Mainstream historians talk about how popular tales and printed books in the Edo period spread urban culture into the countryside of kabuki actors, city scandals, ghost stories. Whether this really gave peasants like you a broader sense of the world or just offered escapism is something historians still argue about. What you know is that for an hour, under this dim lantern, you're somewhere else. That alone is worth more than a handful of coins. Back at home on non-festival nights, your pleasures are smaller, but no less real. You sit by the irori passing around a single sweet potato roasted in the embers, everyone taking careful bites. You listen to the wind in the thatch, the soft cluck of the chickens, the rhythmic scraping as someone whittles a new tool handle or toy. You remember the scarecrow you tried and drowned in the river after that bad year, and someone makes a dark little joke about whether the replacement is doing a better job. You all glance at the fields, then at each other, and laugh quietly. Humor has become another crop you cultivate, right alongside rice and millet. Sometimes, on clear nights, you step outside and crane your neck to see the stars. There's no city light to drown them, the sky feels enormous. You recognize a few constellations your parents taught you, the same ones they learned from theirs. You think about how many tax seasons they endured, how many thin winters they survived. You're not sure if that makes you feel comforted or exhausted, but you stand there a little longer anyway. You've long since made a kind of wary peace with your place in this world. You know you'll never be a samurai, never walk in silk on tatami floors, never have a storehouse so full you lose count. Your victories are smaller and quieter, a year with no famine, a child who grows strong, a harvest that slightly surprises the headman in a good way. When the next tax season looms, you'll feel your shoulders tighten again. You'll scan the sky for the wrong kind of clouds. You'll listen for rumors of policy changes and rice prices. But in between those cycles of stress, you have these pockets of warmth, festivals, jokes, good food on rare days, the feel of your child's head growing heavier on your lap as they fall asleep to the sound of your voice telling a story you only half remember. You're still a peasant in a system that skims off your labor in neat, measurable bales. You still have a hidden hillside patch, a patched kimono, and a granary that never looks as full as you'd like. But you also have drumbeats, lantern light, shared sake, and the deep, stubborn ability to find comfort in very small things. And maybe, lying down at the end of a long day, feeling the straw mat under your back, you let your eyes close and thinking about koku or tax quotas, but about the way the rice paddies look at dusk, reflecting the sky in perfect, trembling mirrors. For a few breaths, that's enough. The year in your village grows quieter now, at least in our story. The fields you've walked so many times fade into a softer kind of darkness, not the threatening kind from storm clouds or hungry officials, but the simple, natural night that settles over everything when the work is done. You can imagine yourself back in that small farmhouse, paper walls dim, a few embers still glowing in the hearth. Outside, the crickets or frogs are doing their endless chorus, but it's distant, like a lullaby coming from another room. The air is a little cool on your face, the rest of you is wrapped in that thin but familiar quilt, the one that smells faintly of smoke and sun and a long line of winters. Somewhere not far away, a neighbor coughs once, turns over, and settles. A dog gives a sleepy huff and decides that whatever it just heard can wait until morning. The village that spent the day worrying about harvests and taxes and side hustles is, for the moment, completely still. If you like, you can picture that hidden hillside patch, quiet under the stars, soil finally resting after all the anxious checking and careful tending. The measuring boxes are stacked far away in some storehouse, their sharp edges and hard numbers no longer reaching this hour. The only counting left to do tonight is the slow, steady rhythm of your own breaths. Your patched kimono hangs in the corner, faintly outlined in the dark, every little stitch a reminder that you've made it through another season, and another before that, and another before that. People have survived this kind of life for centuries and through grand heroics, but through small acts of care, shared jokes, humble meals, and an endless willingness to wake up and try again. So you can let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, let your thoughts wander a little more slowly. The rice will still be growing, the taxes will still exist, the world will still be busy when you wait. For now, though, there's nowhere to go, nothing to fix, nothing to measure. Just that soft, background humming from your fan, maybe in your imaginary jabber the edges of everything into something gentle. Let the village grow distant, let the paddies and festivals and long, muddy days drift to the edges of your mind, like lanterns floating down a dark river, smaller and smaller until they're only tiny points of light. And when even those lights fade, you can follow them into whatever dreams are waiting, knowing that for tonight, at least, you've done enough. End of script. Sweet dreams.